Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this introduction, Bill. I have to think about the co-conspirator. Bill asked me, due to what the conversation in preparation of this conference brought up, to reflect upon one of the themes that were mentioned, and that is in connection with disability experience, to think about the why question. That is, I would call it, it's a delicate subject. When you start to talk about it with people, it sort of taps their deepest emotions about their experiences, which is one of the reasons that once you start to talk about it at a place and an occasion like this one, you need to be precise. And that's probably the reason why I have written down what I want to say, in order not to start improvising, but try to control the language, which is usually a wise thing to do, but on this occasion anyway. I should perhaps mention that the book that Will was talking about is called Disability, Providence and Ethics, Bridging Gaps, Transforming Lives. And the book came out of an experience which is also the occasion for this talk. And that is that over the years I've been speaking with a lot of parents and siblings, particularly of people with cognitive disabilities, because most of my work is in that particular area. Just listening to what they have to say and want to tell you about the experience in their life with sharing with a family member with a cognitive disability. And I always notice that part of that story that they want to share with you is about their experience with the why question. Somehow, that always comes up. And it seems to me that there is a reason for that. And the reason is that virtually everybody who is confronted with disability has the why question on their lips, at least initially. And that's an important qualification throughout this talk, at least initially. The why question comes with the early stage of disability experience, because at that stage, people go through a phase of disorientation. I've heard that many say things like, the world as you know it is falling apart. The ordinary course of your life no longer adds up. Your plans are gone. Your dreams are gone. And this is the kind of experience that I will be thinking about today. But it is important in this connection, and I think it's a timely moment before I start to address the subject, to raise a preliminary question, which is, what does thinking mean in this connection? What is it actually that you want to do? And the reason for raising the question is, thinking about what other people tell you about their experience is by no means an innocent affair, as we all know. So I'm going to spend some time on reflecting upon that. And the issue is representation. You probably know that according to self-advocates, only people with disabilities should talk about disability experience. And there is some wisdom in it that I definitely want to acknowledge. But at the same time, there is reason to ask to what extent that is a wise position to take. And that's what I'm want to address now. For decades, persons with disabilities and their family have been protesting to having their story told by other people. The protest has coined famous phrases like, "Nothing about us without us," indicating that it is important for people to be the subject of their own experience and not have taken their stories away from them by some kind of an expert, be it a psychologist or psychiatrist, a pastoral theologian, or a professor of ethics for that matter. So in the opening pages of her book, The Disabled God, the point that I'm about to address is forcefully made by the late Nancy Eastland, whose work we will be honoring this week. And Nancy speaks in this connection about the power of naming. The power of naming is the power of being at the center of your own story, rather than being pushed to the margin by someone who has taken your story away from you and now is going to explain to you what your life is about. The power of naming is the power to withstand that. And particularly in the field of religion, people with disabilities have had their stories taken away from them. And this occurs when others are telling them what their disability means. We all know those phrases. This is the cross that God has given you to bear, particularly in the Christian community. Somebody must have sinned, since nothing comes from nothing. You have been blessed with this special gift. This is the test to show what you're about in many religious communities. And we all are familiar with those phrases, and we all know what they are meant to do. They are meant to explain to you what your disability is about. So the power of naming has been reclaimed, according to Eastland, because persons with disabilities and their families know that as soon as somebody else starts to talk for you, you're out. You are no longer at the center of your own story, because somebody has taken your place and is going to tell you about your problems, your wants, your needs, and of course all that for your own good. So, in thinking about the why question, as it is called, a temporarily able person, there is ample reason for caution. And therefore, I want to try to explain as precise as possibly what this talk is meant to going to do. Now let me start with an observation. There are tons of stories by people with disabilities out there, published in magazines and books, put on the internet, indicating that people apparently want their story to be heard. I will call these first-person stories, stories where the subject, I am telling you about my life with a disability or with a person with a disability. These stories offer an account of how people understand what has been happening to them. And very often, the why question, at least at the initial state, is part of that account. So, the first reason for thinking about the why question is that one can make an attempt. Guys like me can make an attempt to listen to what people are telling and try to understand what it is they're trying to say. Nancy Eastland addresses the point about listening in a piece in which she accounted for her need to be part of the church, even when that need didn't square very well with her engagement in the disability rights movement, as she puts it. Eastland held the church to be a place to find people capable of listening, but she was disappointed in this respect. This is a quote from that piece. Too often, she says, too often temporarily able-bodied people have been eager to devise strategies of response to what they deem as the unhealthy lives of persons with disabilities before they have just listened. They have attempted to speak for us, deciding how and where we can best serve God before they have just listened. Now, End of quote. Now, when Iceland asked people of faith community to just listen before they decide to do anything, her meaning of the word just has a double meaning. Just listening means to be ready to hear what people are telling you without assumptions or preconceptions. It does not simply mean listening, but listening in the manner of justice, which implies heeding people's call to be heard for what they have to say. A second observation is closely connected. It regards the presence of others that are willing to listen. Stories want to be heard. That's why they are told. This means that telling one's story succeeds in the presence of careful listening, and only then. In other words, speaking up for oneself is a communicative rather than an individual act. The power of naming is not realized by an individual who is taking the stand, that is to say, but it is a social activity. People with disabilities are empowered because they speak up for themselves and because there are those who are willing to listen. Let me add then that in the context of faith community, I would suggest that the willingness to listen is an act of fellowship. A third comment regards the task of listening as a disability advocate. In thinking about disability experience as a temporarily able person, one can adopt the role of a disability advocate. Not a self-advocate, to be sure, but an advocate nonetheless. The point why there are so many first stories out there is that people often feel that their disability experience is not very well understood. Cultural images of disability are not very favorable, we all know that, which means that people's experience often is framed by negative expectations. And there is in this respect a task of educating the general population then. And one way to participate in that task is not to presume that one can speak for other people, but to assume the task of somebody who wants to listen, and listen carefully, in order to reflect upon what one hears people are saying. This, I think, provides a further reason for thinking about people's experience with the why question. The reason is to advocate for the task of careful listening. This is, for example, a task that Henry Nouwen took on in his last book, called Adam, God's Beloved. In being Adam's assistant at daybreak in Toronto, Nouwen learned to listen to what Adam, a severely disabled young man, was telling him, even when Adam never spoke a word. Was telling him about his experience with a severe disability. And in that connection, Nouwen reflects on the thought that Adam's presence is a gift. And then, in that connection, he makes a very important observation. A gift is only given, he says, when it is received. A gift is only given when it is received. So, whether Adam's life is truly a gift depends on whether his friend Henry knows how to receive it. And I would like here to paraphrase Nouwen's insight and say that also for a story it is true that it is told when it has been received. Telling one's story, as I put it before, is a communicative act. A story is told when it is carefully listened to and heard. And it occurs to me that this is an important aspect of sharing disability experience in the context of faith. At the very least, fellowship in faith communities should entail taking on the task of advocating for careful listening. So, in an attempt to do just that this morning, let me ask, in connection with disability experience, what sort of a question is the why question? What are people exactly doing in raising that question? Well, to begin with, it appears that the why question is strongly connected with the sudden confrontation with disability. There has been an accident, or a birth of a disabled child, or an outbreak of an incurable but devastating disease, and all of a sudden, completely unexpected, people are confronted by the experience of disability. And that is when the why question kicks in. It arises at a particular time. Facing the confrontation of what is happening to them, people often talk about how devastated they are, at least at that time. In arising at this time, the why question seems inevitably connected with the notion of disability as tragedy and catastrophe. And it is true, of course, that many people with disability resent the language of tragedy and catastrophe because they don't experience their lives in that way. And in the light of what I have been saying before, one might add that the language of tragedy and catastrophe is one of the ways in which their stories are taken away from them when others talk about their disability as a tragedy. There clearly is a tension, however, because in reading first-person stories of disability experience, we will find the language of tragedy and catastrophe is often there, particularly, as I repeat, in the initial stage. So, when the why question arises from their mouth, what, if anything, are people asking for when they ask why? This is an important question, and this is a pertinent question because it has been responsible for a strand of wrong-headed religious talk. The why question has often been taken as a question for understanding, and that's not strange, because ordinarily when somebody asks why, it is because they want to know something. So, if people raising the why question in our context, do they want to know anything? When I understand the accounts that I've been seeing, and I've seen quite a lot, I think, when I understand them correctly, people raising the why question are not asking for anything. They are not asking for a cause. Your baby has Down syndrome because she has a chromosome too many. People already know that. And they are still asking, why did this happen? Nor is the why question asking for a reason. Somebody must have sinned for this tragedy to have occurred. Again, none of the answers ever has stopped people from asking why. Why this? Why me? Why this child? It seems to me, therefore, that the why question is not about people wanting to know something, because whatever answers come their way, the question will not stop. At least at the initial stage of their disability experience, there is no answer that could ease people's pain. And if this is correct, it means that the why question is foremost a lament. And here I'm following my friend John Swinton in his book, Raging with Compassion. It's a cry of despair rather than a question of information. Whatever people use to express what it is they are going through, most of them will tell you, as I put it before, that their world is falling apart. The why question indicates a time of crisis in which people are facing a gap. In the case of people with, for example, with traumatic brain injury, there is literally a gap in their memory, but the imagery of a gap is helpful, I think, as a metaphor with regard to other disability experiences as well. So, A gap, one might ask, between what and what? Now, the metaphor of a gap or an abyss suggests two sides, like I recall from my visit to the Grand Canyon, that it has a north rim and a south rim. That's what you have with a gap or an abyss. It has two sides. But the metaphor of a gap, as I use, is not about space, it's about time. It's about the abyss that separates the before and after. People have been living ordinary lives, like most other people do, when all of a sudden they find their lives disrupted. Not just disrupted, but disrupted in ways that at that moment appear to them as horrific. Your life plan is gone, that's what they tell you. And life as they knew it has ceased to exist. As soon as the message about the TBI came through, I knew my life would never be the same. That's the experience of the gap. I recall a father telling me about the birth of his daughter with Down syndrome. Actually, she was Henry Nouwen's niece, and the father was his brother. Many years after the fact, when he was reflecting upon her birth, he told me what his first thought at the moment had been. Now I can never die. That's what he said. It was the first thought about his daughter. I never forgot that he said it because it was a most profound account of the disruption of ordinary time that I ever heard. Now that this child is born, I can never die. So the why question is a cry of lament that arises within a specific time frame then. And it is important to reflect upon this time frame. The time before indicates life as people ordinarily know it. It's the time in which people have found their story, in which they have been formed to become who they are. In other words, the time before is the time that has shaped their identity, in which they have found themselves. And the gap between the time before and the time after indicates that this formative time has collapsed. It's gone. My life will never be the same. And when people face this gap, they basically have lost the life that enabled them to make sense of themselves. So, if one wants to put this in religious language, one might say what people have lost at the moment of crisis is their old self, the self that they have become familiar with. They have lost what shaped their orientation and what marked their place in the world. So that's on one side of the gap. What's on the other? On the other side is an unknown but dreaded future. The confrontation with disability experience comes with many questions, but most of these questions cannot be answered with any degree of certainty, at least at the initial stage. Even for people who are facing the same conditions, the answers to these questions might turn out very differently. And given this amount of uncertainty, it follows that at this stage of disability experience, people will necessarily be uncertain about themselves. They never have been there. There will be tons of information out there, to be sure, but nonetheless, people feel insecure. The reason for this insecurity is that they have lost their old selves, as I put it, and depending on the answers, what the answers are going to be to all that question, they will find out, and they have to find out, if they are actually capable of living this uncertain life. Of the many images that I projected on the future of me and my baby being the mother of a disabled child, was never one of them. That's facing the life of uncertainty. Not only about your child, but also about yourself. A woman who was a musician told me that as a young mother-to-be, she had been dreaming of teaching her daughter how to play the piano, so that they could play together and her house would be filled with music, as it used to be. Then her baby turned out to be born with a muscular disease. It was not going to be that music. End of dream. The confrontation with disability experience, I have learned from people who have been there, comes then with the challenge of discovering a new self. People need to find out things about themselves they never had to find out in the time before. Life had been good, their careers have been successful to some extent, and now they have to discover what the goodness of life entails under significantly changed conditions. They will have to find out what being successful means under conditions that in the eyes of the world rules out the possibility of success. Most of all, they have to find out whether they themselves are capable of living that kind of life and enjoy it. And at this point, one can clearly see why people with disabilities that have made the journey resent the language of tragedy and catastrophe, precisely at this point. They have taken on the many challenges that they have faced on the way, and they have managed, in one way or another, to rediscover themselves anew, so to speak. The language of tragedy and catastrophe hypothesizes the initial stage of their experience as if their journey didn't count. But in the time after, the thing that matters most is the journey itself. They have tried to live their lives as best as they can, and in the process, they have discovered themselves again as a different person, a person whose disability experience has been integrated into a new identity. Yes, I am the mother of a girl with Down syndrome. Yes, I am this person with cerebral palsy, and it's all right. Given that journey, being talked about in terms of a tragic life is a denial that people naturally resent. The language of tragedy and catastrophe then recognizes what people go through at the initial stage of their experience, and as such, it is not necessarily wrong, but it cannot have the last word, as many people have actually testified with the lives they are living. Now, of course, it can be argued in this connection that disability will only appear as a tragedy because most people have been socialized within the cult of normalcy, as Tom Reynolds has it in his book, The Communion of Vulnerability. And I think that's true. People have been socialized in a cult of normalcy, and that partly explains why initially disability appears as a tragedy. But that's not all there is to be said about this, because precisely because people have been socialized in that culture, the experience of tragedy cannot be but very real to them. Quite often there will be mistaken beliefs about disability at work, for sure, but at the initial stage of their disability experience, that is something that people have not yet found out. People have yet to discover that there is life, enjoyable life, beyond the gap. At the time that the why question is on their lips, they have not yet discovered that because the journey is still to begin. They have not yet discovered the possibility of a new self because that possibility as a possibility is even only discovered once the journey has been embarked upon. Finally, let me reflect upon what these thoughts might entail for bringing communities of faith together around the theme of disability and disability support. We all know that the first response in these busy times, not to speak of business times, is to set goals, determine targets, preferably in smart language, and then get the organization in place to get things done. However, when it comes to acknowledging people with disabilities in their midst, community of faith might be able to do something that, in my view, is far more important. They might operate very differently instead of doing all kinds of things. Before you know, they have set up a new target group, and then we really are in trouble. When in this light, I look once again at what first-person stories are telling us, it occurs to me that what is asked for is something different and actually much simpler. And in case you're interested in that, it might be less costly also, which is not an irrelevant point in terms of business. Looking at what people tell us about the journey is that sharing the story, as I put it before, is an act of communion. It's sharing a story. Perhaps some people with disability can make it on their own, but not many do. The discovery of our personal identity is only achieved in social interaction with others, and in this regard, disability identity and its discovery is not different. The truth about community, then, is that we need others to find out who we are. We need others to find out who we are. And the way to find out who we are is to recognize the journey, look back from where we came, and then give an account of who we have become. Recognizing the journey, then, other people's journey as well as our own, with or without disabilities, is possible only insofar as the stories that tell about the journey are heard. And this is why the most important thing for faith community is to take on the task of advocating for careful listening. I thank you for your attention.